Greetings. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we're going to do a review of Chapter 3 of the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, inshallah. Title of Chapter 3 is The Struggle for an Education. One day, Booker learned about a great school for colored people in Virginia. The school could provide opportunities in trade or industry. The school was named Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia. At this time, Booker felt that this was better than heaven. After hearing about Hampton, Booker began working for the wife of the owner of the salt mine and coal mines. Booker was making $5 per month. Booker noticed that the woman was a perfectionist who demanded honesty. Booker worked for her for a year and a half before going to Hampton. He says, quote, "The lessons I learned in the home of Mrs. Ruffner were as valuable to me as any education I have gotten anywhere else." Booker says, quote, "Mrs. Ruffner always encouraged me and sympathized with me in all my efforts to get an education." In the fall of 1872, and I estimate Booker to be in his early teens at this time, 13, 14, maybe even 15, Booker was determined to make an effort to go to Hampton Institute, but he didn't know where Hampton was. And the reason why I say that age, he said that his mother told him about the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think he would have been about 5 years old at that time, 5 or 6, and 72 would have been another 7 years added on to that. So I think, early teens. That's my guess. The money that he earned working was given to his family. He had little money to buy clothes and to pay traveling expenses. Booker says, quote, "The thing that touched and pleased me most in connection with my starting for Hampton was the interest that the other colored people took in the matter. They spent the best of their life in slavery and never expected to see the day when they would see a member of their race attending school. Finally, the day came for Booker to go to Hampton. His mother was in poor health, and he did not expect to see her again. The distance from Malden to Hampton is about 500 miles. A few hours after Booker left Malden, he realized he didn't have enough money to reach Hampton. During the journey, they had to stop at a hotel, and Booker wished he could get a room because it was cold in the wintertime. Booker says, quote, "This was my first experience in finding out what the color of my skin meant. He stayed warm by walking through the night." He says, quote, my whole soul was so bent upon reaching Hampton that I did not have time to cherish any bitterness towards the hotel keeper or the individuals that wouldn't let him stay in the hotel because he was black. By walking and begging for rides, Booker was able to reach Richmond, Virginia. This was the first time Booker had ever been in a large city, and he was completely out of money at this time. He didn't have anywhere to sleep, and he didn't have anything to eat. And he writes, quote, "I was tired, I was hungry, I was everything but discouraged," end quote. He slept on the sidewalk and used his satchel as a pillow. The next day, he went to unload a cargo ship for food money. He continued to work and unload the cargo ship and sleep under the sidewalk in order to save up money to get to Hampton. He writes, quote, "In order to economize in every way possible so as to be sure to reach Hampton in a reasonable time, I continued to sleep under the same sidewalk that gave me shelter the first night I was in Richmond," end quote. When Booker had enough money to reach Hampton, he thanked the captain of the cargo ship that he worked for his kindness, and Booker continued on his journey. He reached Hampton and had 50 cents left over to begin his education. Booker said that the three-story brick school was the largest building he had ever seen. He writes, quote, "It seemed to me to be the largest and most beautiful building I had ever seen. The sight of it seemed to give me new life. I felt that a new kind of existence had begun, that life now had a new beginning, had a new meaning, sorry. I felt that I had reached the promised land, and I resolved to let no obstacle prevent me from putting forth the highest effort to fit myself to accomplish the most good in the world." End quote. As soon as Booker reached Hampton Institute, he found the head teacher so that he could be assigned to a class. Booker didn't have food, clothes, or access to a bath, and he didn't think that he made a good impression and could tell that his intelligence, was already being questioned. Booker had to follow the teacher around and watch as other kids were being accepted to the school. After some time, the teacher asked Booker to sweep the room next door, and Booker writes, quote, "It occurred to me at once that here was my chance. Never did I receive an order with more delight." End quote. Booker swept the room 3 times and dusted it 4 times. Booker writes, quote, "I had the feeling that in a large measure my future depended upon the impression I made upon the teacher in the cleaning of that room." In other words, he knew his task of sweeping the floor was an opportunity for him to prove that he was worthy of acceptance. The teacher inspected the room with a white glove, and when she couldn't find any dirt, she replied, quote, "I guess you will do to enter the institution." End quote. They tested Booker with the expectation that he would fail. Booker gave the head teacher no excuse as to why he should not be admitted to Hampton. Booker says, quote, "He was one of the happiest souls on earth." End quote. Booker also acknowledged that he was only one of many slaves that were determined to, quote, "secure an education at any cost." End quote. Due to his cleaning ability, Booker was offered a janitor position. He used this position to save money to get into school. Regarding the work, Booker writes, quote, "The work was hard and taxing, but I stuck to it. I had a large number of rooms to care for and had to work late into the night, while at the same time I had to rise by 4 o'clock in the morning in order to build the fires and have a little time in which to prepare my lessons." End quote. He credits his teacher, Miss Mackey, saying, quote, "One of my strongest and most helpful friends. Her advice and encouragement were always helpful in strengthening me in the darkest hour." End quote. Booker also gives credit to his mentor, writing, quote, "I have spoken of the impression that was made upon me by the buildings and general appearance of Hampton Institute, but I have not spoken of that which made the greatest and most lasting impression upon me, and that was a great man, the noblest, rarest human being that it has ever been my privilege to meet. I refer to the late General Samuel C. Armstrong." Booker later writes, quote, "The older I grow, the more I am convinced that there is no education which one can get from books and costly apparatus that is equal to that which can be gotten from the contact with great men and women. Instead of studying books so constantly, how I wish that our schools and colleges might learn to study men and things." End quote. Booker also mentioned how the older students were happy to stay outside in tents in the winter for General Armstrong. Students were very proud to serve General Armstrong. The students had a Christ-like view of General Armstrong. Booker credits a lot of his maturity and development to his time at Hampton, writing, quote, "Life at Hampton was a constant revelation to me, was constantly taking me into a new world. The matter of having meals at regular hours, of eating on a tablecloth, using a napkin, the use of a bathtub and the toothbrush, as well as the use of sheets upon the bed, were all new to me." Booker continues, quote, "I sometimes feel that almost the most valuable lesson I got at the Hampton Institute was in the use and value of the bath. I learned there for the first time some of its value, not only in keeping the body healthy, but inspiring self-respect and promoting virtue." End quote. And Booker always sought a daily bath, and he washed his one pair of socks daily. Booker was able to pay full board with his janitor service. And he mentions a Mr. Morgan of New Bedford, Massachusetts, forgiving tuition, which is $70 per year, based on what I got. After he had been at Hampton for a while, Booker had trouble maintaining books and clothing. He was able to borrow books from more fortunate students, but clothing was more difficult. Booker had very few clothes. He writes, quote, "As to clothes, when I reached Hampton, I had practically nothing," end quote. General Armstrong would personally inspect students' clothes and shoes to make sure they were clean. Booker writes, quote, "To wear one suit of clothing continually while at work in the schoolroom and at the same time to keep it clean, while at work and in the schoolroom and at the same time to keep it clean was rather a hard problem for me to solve," end quote. Booker was eventually able to get secondhand clothes from his teachers and donations sent from people who lived in the North. And these are just strangers donating to the cause. Booker was one of the youngest students at Hampton at the time. He writes, quote, "Most of the students were men and women, some as old as 40 years of age," end quote. Booker felt honored to be in the presence of 300 or 400 people as serious as these individuals. Most of these individuals had enough contact with the real world to understand the importance of education. And he's talking about older individuals coming right out of slavery. So I assume he's saying they understood the relative value difference between ignorance and some level of school knowledge. Many struggled to read or were poor like Booker, but still had to provide for their family. So they still had to work, even though they were going to school. Booker writes, quote, "The great and prevailing idea that seemed to take possession of everyone was to prepare himself to lift up the people at his home. No one seemed to think of himself," and end quote. Regarding the teachers, Booker writes, quote, "Whenever it is written, and I hope it will be, the part that the Yankee teachers played in the education immediately after the war will make one of the most thrilling parts of the history of this country. The time is not far distant when the whole South will appreciate this service in a way that is not able to be seen," end quote. And that's the end of chapter 3. Make sure you get the book yourself, read the book, read the chapter for yourself. Share it if you like anything that you heard. Comment if you disagree with anything that you heard. Visit the Tuskegee, www.tuskegee.edu, I believe, if you want to donate to the school that he built. So I'll see y'all in chapter 4. And peace out. Assalamu alaikum.